when we talk about the gut in general, I think it's a vast unknown. And the microbiome, right? So I want us, even though my listeners are smart, savvy people, I want us to go back to the very beginning and have you help us understand what is the microbiome other than like all the stars in the sky, which is how it's commonly
Yeah. I mean,
described. What is this that we need to be so interested in?
yeah, it's so interesting because I'm sure when both of us trained, there was little to no information. It really has been the last 5 to 10 years. And if we understand that there is more viruses, protozoa, fungi that are part of our bodies than there are human cells, to give you a sense, it's 40 trillion microorganisms that line every square inch of our bodies, inside and outside. But specific to the gut microbiome, understanding that the gut microbiome, as intangible as it seems to be for many people, because we cannot see it like a bone or the heart or the brain, it is interrelated with every system, every organ in the
Yes.
body. And so this complex interrelationship is both fascinating to me and also so complex because if you understand that your microbiome starts from the top of your head to the tip of your toes, it starts from your mouth all the way down to your anus. We have microbiomes in our mouth. We have microbiomes in the lung. We have microbiomes, the gut bone axis. There is a microbiome in our vaginal area. And I think for a lot of people, because we cannot see these organisms, we assume they're not there. We assume they're not important. And over the last 10 years, I really have been privy, although at the beginning I did not fully understand or appreciate how important supporting the microbiome is vis-a-vis the hormonal changes that are occurring in perimenopause and menopause. So much so that I humbly sit back and say, oh my gosh, if I had understood more, I could have been far more proactive, not just with patients, but with myself. And so when we talk about the microbiome, it's this complex interplay. It is 40 trillion, as I stated, bacteria, protozoa, fungi, et cetera, viruses that live for the most part happily and hospitably in our bodies.
Mhm.
And understanding the role of stress and sleep and nutrition and these hormonal changes that we now no longer called sex hormones, but
Yes.
progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, the complex interplay with our immune system when we go into menopause is largely dictated by the health of the microbiome. And so I think that when I decided to pitch this idea to my editor, I wasn't entirely sure she was going to be interested, but she said, really, no one is putting all these pieces together. And so I think this is a way for both clinicians and the lay public to really understand, like, what are the things we can be doing proactively to offset this hormonal flux that it's going to come whether we realize it or not. The other thing that I think is important to mention, there's something called the microgenderome, which is a fancy way of saying our microbiomes as children are very similar with young girls, young boys. It's not until the influence of alterations in hormones, the estrogen, progesterone, testosterone in puberty, that shifts the dynamics of the microbiome substantially. That also happens in pregnancy if we go on to have pregnancies. And then, fascinating enough, perimenopause is the next big P that shifts the microbiome again. And life comes full circle because in menopause, our diversity, the species of what we find in the microbiome starts to resemble men's again, because that is how dynamic these hormones are with this interplay and communication in the microbiome. But unlike men, their microbiomes have stayed fairly consistently. Ours do this 360-degree loop throughout the trajectory of our young lives into our middle age lives and beyond.
Isn't that fascinating? I mean, I had never heard the word microgenderome, right? But it makes sense because from a genetic standpoint, many organ systems are made from one organ system and then differentiate. So why would we recreate the way things are designed, right? And just do it. But if we think about this in terms of um, late premenopause to perimenopause to, let's not hit menopause yet, but let's stop in the decades of late 30s all the way through mid 40s. What are some of the initial not only microbiome, but gut changes because the permeability changes. Those what are the key things that happen? And then how do they manifest? How does somebody feel that, if at all?
Well, and it's interesting. I always used to like to use myself as the example of around 2018, I took a trip to Morocco, and my husband and I ate the same food throughout this trip. I got horrific food poisoning. The joke is, everyone goes to Morocco and picks up a friend. And by that I mean friend, an
Little
opportunistic
friends.
an opportunistic friend we don't want. But I got terrible food poisoning. At the time I kept saying, how could we have eaten the same food and yet you were fine and I wasn't? Has a lot to do with the immune system changes that are occurring. Estrogen really is the glue for the immune system. Estradiol, the predominant form of estrogen our bodies make. So I think in many ways, you astutely mentioned the leaky gut, which we'll get to. But I think for a lot of people, they'll start noticing that they are more likely to have opportunistic infections. And that is a byproduct of this estrogen glue, if you will. Think of it as mortar to help with the one cell layer thick of the small intestine. Right alongside that one cell layer thick is the immune system. So anything that breaches the small intestinal lining will activate the immune system. So for me, I had this massive immune response
Mhm.
to this foreign, turned out to be Giardia. This
Oh,
Yeah, it was fun. This opportunistic infection, and so that then mounts this immune response. So there's definitely gut barrier breakdown, more inflammation. Interestingly enough, leaky gut can lead to alterations in something called lipopolysaccharide, which is this endotoxin with gram-negative bacteria that can pass through our circulation. Which, if you get food poisoning, you feel really bad. You might have fevers, you might be achy. That is your body trying to mount an immune response. And so the systemic inflammation then leads to, this ramping up in the immune system. But what's interesting is our immune system, as we're navigating, perimenopause into the latter stages, it isn't as robust. The immune system of a perimenopausal woman is not what it was 10, 15 years ago. And so what's interesting to me is that shows up as, oh, I got this opportunistic infection, but we don't understand is that rampant inflammation stays elevated. We don't mount as strong of we have two ways of thinking about the immune system. We have this kind of primordial, basic inflammatory response. It's not as targeted. Then we have a much more, the acquired innate immune system, which is much more robust. That's where you talk about antibodies and B cells and T cells. That even takes a hit and it starts to kind of create this situation where there just tends to be more overt inflammation. And what's interesting, Vonda, and is relevant to you, is that more inflammation actually leads to more bone breakdown. And so I remind people that leaky gut is not benign. We know women are 4 to 5 times more likely to develop autoimmune conditions in the perimenopause to menopause transition, but it also impacts the health of our bone. And so, early stages of people, whether they're osteopenic or very young women with osteoporosis, I'm sure that you do see that. Other things that happen is we get this reduction in short chain fatty acid production. And these are signaling molecules, and they're really important because they help kind of bolster the health of the gut microbiome, the gut lining, which we just mentioned is one cell layer thick. They're important for lowering inflammation, they're important for blood sugar stability. And I oftentimes will talk about how they're important for satiety. They are intricately connected to a keystone bacteria called Akkermansia, which is, has started to get a lot more attention and press recently. But I remind people that they're also involved in endogenous, so what our body makes inside, endogenous GLP-1 regulation. So we talk about these very powerful synthetic drugs, which are very important and impactful, but our body also does this naturally. And so we just think about this like domino effect of what's happening: more inflammation, more leaky gut, more likely to deal with bone resorption, more likely to deal with alterations in short chain fatty acids. And a lot of people will say to me, it's not important to consume fiber. And I oftentimes
really?
will say, I do hear that. In fact, I call it the new F word because I've even been interviewed on some podcasts where people have
Uh-huh.
said, I'd love to have you as a guest, but we can't talk about fiber.
Huh.
And
What
so
is the reasoning behind that?
there are definitely rigid dogmatic principles in the nutrition space, and certainly
Hmm,
people that are long-term carnivore aficionados,
I see.
feel that
Mm.
fiber is not important. And I can tell you from all the research that I have read for writing this book, it is evident to me that we need more fiber in perimenopause and menopause than we ever did, because fiber is so important for supporting this short chain fatty acid production. And I think in a lot of different ways, I could also make the argument that lower short chain fatty acid production can also weaken signaling with bone health, so the gut bone axis. I would say the other thing is when we have alterations in estrogen, we have changes in immune system regulation. We don't absorb nutrients the same way. So whether it's calcium, magnesium, vitamin D metabolism, which I think a lot of people don't know that it's actually a prohormone. It's not just a vitamin. And so those are kind of the key kind of higher level things that I think are important for people to understand. I would say the other thing that I think is really important to understand is that gut microbiome is interplays with every other system in the body. So if your mouth is not healthy, mouth microbiome isn't healthy, your gut microbiome, your vaginal microbiome, they're all interrelated. It's all fixable. Let me be clear, but it's things that really involve adjusting lifestyle, and then obviously consideration to replacing and replenishing hormones, supplements as well. But it is so vital to understand that there's a lot we can do, but also understand that there's a lot that in terms of research that's still kind of evolving. But we certainly have good clues that the gut microbiome is a key longevity kind of marker for the body, and probably wasn't thought about in that way previously.